He never conquered a single nation in his life. Not one. And that is exactly why 200 years later, this kingdom is the only one from this story still standing on a map with its own flag, its own king, and its own name. This was the most violent stretch of years in the recorded history of Southern Africa. An era so brutal that some of the people who lived through it didn't even have a name for war anymore. They called it Mfecane, or so the crushing. Entire nations were being erased off the map in a single season. Whole clans turned to eating their own dead just to survive the famine that followed. And in the middle of all of it, one man built an entire country. Not by being the most feared man in the region, by refusing to be. His name when he was born wasn't Moshoeshoe I, it was Lepoko. It means dispute, because around the time that he was born, somebody in his village had just been accused of witchcraft, and the argument over it was still going when he arrived. He was the son of a minor chief named Mokachane, who led maybe 4,000 people at most. Not a king, not a warlord. A small man in a small clan in a part of Southern Africa that in 1786, nobody outside of it had any reason to care about. By 6 years old, he was tending his family's sheep, but there was one thing about him that was already different. He spent time as a boy with an old chief named Molom, a man known across the region not for the size of his army, because he barely had one, but for something else entirely. People said Molomi could walk into a rival camp and walk out with peace instead of war. And Molomi taught the boy who would become Moshoeshoe I one lesson that the rest of this story is going to test again and again, under conditions that would break almost anyone else. Treat your friends well, but treat your enemies exactly the same way. It's a nice thing to say at 14 years old. It is a completely different thing to actually do it when people coming for you have just burned down everything you own. Because around 1820, when Moshoeshoe I was 34 years old and had just become the chief of his own small clan, the world around him started to come apart. Far to the east, a king named Shaka had taken a small, unremarkable Zulu chiefdom and turned it into a military machine unlike anything the region had seen. Disciplined regiments, short stabbing spears instead of throwing ones, and a doctrine that said conquer or be absorbed. There was no third option. Every clan Shaka's army broke apart sent another wave of desperate, displaced people crashing into the next territory over, and the next, and the next. Therefore, by the time that the wave reached the area where Moshoeshoe I lived, it didn't arrive as one army. It arrived as dozens of armed, starving, terrified groups, each one trying to survive by taking from whoever was weaker than they were. In 1822, one of those groups, a force led by a chieftainess named Matatasi, leading thousands of refugees turned raiders in her own right, attacked Moshoeshoe I's mountain stronghold at Butabute. He lost. He didn't have an army that could compete with what was coming. He didn't have the numbers, the weapons, or the time to build one either. So he did the only thing that made any sense for a small chief with nothing left but the people still willing to follow him. He ran. In July of 1824, Moshoeshoe I led his people onto a flat-topped sandstone plateau, ringed almost entirely by sheer cliffs, with only a handful of narrow passes leading to the top. He climbed it for the first time at night. He named it Thaba Bosiu, mountain at night. And then he let a rumor spread that the mountain itself grew taller while the sun was down. Just enough superstition to make any enemy think twice about a night attack. But a mountain alone doesn't build a nation. People do. And right now, the only people Moshoeshoe I had were the ones who'd survived the same disaster he had. Therefore, he made a decision that, on its surface, sounds reckless. Instead of turning away every desperate, displaced group that showed up at the base of his mountain, he started taking them in. Anyone fleeing the chaos, anyone who'd lost everything, anyone with nowhere left to go. He gave them grazing land, he gave them cattle. He asked them for loyalty in return, not submission. But in 1826, that policy got tested in the most extreme way it possibly could. A group calling themselves cannibals, survivors of the famine who had turned to eating the dead and in some cases each other just to stay alive, were operating not far from Thaba Bosiu under a chief named Rakotosana. One of the people they had eaten was Moshoeshoe I's own grandfather, Piete. Think about what that means for a second. By every code of honor in that era, by every code in almost any era, Moshoeshoe I had the right, maybe even the obligation, to hunt these men down and execute every last one of them. Instead, he sent his own regiments out not to kill Rakotoswana's men, but to bring them back. He stood in front of the men who had eaten his grandfather, told them he understood exactly what kind of desperation makes a human being do something like that, and then had his medicine men put them through a purification ritual. And then he did something that, to this day, historians still describe as almost unbelievable. He gave them cattle, he gave them grain and seed, and he told them to go start a normal life again. Some of those men refused to leave. They told him no ruler had ever understood their situation the way he just had, and they asked to become his subjects instead. That is not the act of a soft man. That is the act of a man running an experiment in real time on the worst possible test case available to him, in discovering that it actually worked. Word of mouth that gets around. By the late 1820s, Thaba Bosiu wasn't just a hideout anymore. It was becoming known across an entire region full of broken, displaced clans as the one place where you could go and arrive with nothing and not be turned away and not be enslaved and not be killed for your cattle. Therefore, people kept coming, not by the dozen, by the thousand. But a mountain full of people and cattle isn't just a sanctuary anymore. It's a target. In 1827 or 1828, depending on which account you trust, a Zulu-speaking group named the Amangwane, led by a chief named Matiwane, attacked Thaba Bosiu directly, testing for the first time whether this so-called impregnable mountain actually was. It didn't work. Moshoeshoe I held part of his forces back in hiding, then threw them into the fight at exactly the moment the attackers thought they'd broken through. The Amangwane were routed. They never came back. 1 year later, in 1829, the Batlokoa attacked again, and this time they picked their moment carefully. Moshoeshoe I was away from the mountain entirely, out on a cattle raid of his own. His people held the mountain without him. Therefore, by 1830, a pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every army that had tried to take the Thaba Bosiu by force had failed. Every refugee who had asked Thaba Bosiu for protection had received it. One method was working and the other wasn't. But none of that had been tested yet against one kind of enemy who actually had a real chance of ending it for good. His name was Mzilikazi, and before he was anyone's enemy, he had been one of Shaka's own generals, until the two of them fell out and Mzilikazi fled north with his own regiments rather than wait to find out what Shaka intended to do about it. He didn't just survive that escape. He built his own kingdom out of it. He took everything he had learned from Shaka's war machine, the discipline, the regiments, the doctrine of conquer or absorb, and used it to carve a brand new nation, the Ndebele, out of everyone unlucky to be standing in his army's path. By 1831, that path led directly to Thaba Bosiu. That was not the Amangwane. This was not the Batlokoa. This was a force built deliberately in the image of the most effective war machine Southern Africa had ever produced, led by a man who had personally helped build the original. If Moshoeshoe I lost here, everything he had built since 1824, every refugee he had taken in, every enemy he had turned into a citizen, would end on this mountain in one afternoon. The Ndebele Impis came at the passes from 5 directions at once. But Thaba Bosiu held. The cliffs were too steep, the passes too narrow, and the men defending them too well prepared. Mzilikazi's army, the same army that would go on to conquer territory stretching all the way into what is now Zimbabwe, was thrown back down the mountain in defeat. Therefore, Moshoeshoe I now had a choice in front of him that none of his previous tests had actually offered. He had just beaten the most dangerous army to ever come for him. It was retreating in disorder, exhausted, and according to the accounts that survive, starving. He had every justification, every piece of moral cover, and every tactical advantage required to finish them. No one watching would have blamed him. Most leaders in his position would have done exactly that. Instead, He sent cattle down the mountain to the same enemy that had just tried to wipe him off it, with a message that he understood it wasn't hatred that had brought them to his door, it was hunger, and he held nothing against a hungry man. Mzilikazi's army withdrew, and in every year that followed, through everything else Mzilikazi went on to conquer, his forces never attacked Lesotho again. It is tempting to look at everything you just heard and call it kindness. A nice man in a brutal era who got lucky enough to survive on good intentions. I don't accept that framing though. Every single act of mercy in this story, the cannibals, the amangwane he absorbed rather than annihilated, the tribute he sent to keep Shaka himself at distance, the kettle he sent down that mountain to Mzilikazi's retreating army, served the exact same strategic function that conquest served for every other ruler in this era. It grew his population, it grew his territory, it grew his legitimacy. The only difference is that conquest does it by force, and force creates enemies who wait for their moment to come back. Moshoeshoe I's method did it by turning people who should have been enemies into people who had the most reason to stay loyal to him. Shaka was assassinated by his own half-brothers in 1828, and the kingdom he built through pure conquest tore itself apart in the succession crisis that followed. Mzilikazi's Ndebele kingdom, built by replicating that same model further north, eventually fell to British colonial forces 6 decades later. Moshoeshoe I's kingdom is the one still standing. Lesotho is a sovereign nation today, one of the only borders in this entire region that has survived, almost entirely unbroken from the moment he founded it on that mountain in 1824. That is not an accident of geography. The mountain helped, sure, but plenty of other defensible mountains in this exact region held by men who chose differently are empty ruins with nobody's name attached to them anymore. Moshoeshoe I's choice is the reason his still has people on it. He never conquered anyone. That's why no one could conquer him. Shaka built an empire that didn't survive him. Mzilikazi built one that outran him. Moshoeshoe built his out of the people every other army had already given up on. And 200 years later, his is the only one still standing, with its own flag, its own mountain, and under its own name.